Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Meshkati. I'm a professor at the Viterbi School of Engineering. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome you to our last panel. This is a very interesting group of colleagues that we have. The title of the panel is The Next Generation Ethics and Technology, or Technology and Society. However, I would like, before I ask my first panelist to start, my colleague, Dr. Ali Abbas, when he was convening this conference, he said that he wanted me also to speak. I said, no, we have much more interesting speakers from outside and inside. I think they will enjoy hearing from our other colleagues. But he said that I say a few words about what I do, and I just want to spare your time and ask you to think about one thing. I noticed from the morning, Rashi mentioned about BP. There have been the discussion of the BP many times over here in this meeting. This poor soul has had a distinct, sad experience of looking after the BP messes at the BP Texas City refinery explosion in 2005. I got there with the U.S. Chemical Safety Board people. I bought a steel tow booth. That accident killed 13 people, injured 180. And then I was also on the panel, one of the national panels that investigated BP Deepwater Horizon. Again, that one killed 11 people and injured 16. This is what you see if the safety culture and ethical value, they don't exist in the companies, unfortunately. And another example that I would like to share with you just for 1 minute about to see the importance and application of the ethics and safety culture is, how many of you, ladies and gentlemen, again, please accept that this is not a condescending question, and I tell you why. How many of you, ladies and gentlemen, have you heard about Fukushima accident? Excellent. That is what I expected. And how many of you, ladies and gentlemen, in this group, have you heard of Onagawa nuclear power plant? Rashi and my good friend Ketan. Very good. Anybody? And of course, Andrea. This is very, very small group. I mean, why you haven't heard about Onagawa while almost everybody, and this question I ask, the same question at the meeting at the International Atomic Energy Agency with 400 people in the room. Meeting on the 30th anniversary of Chernobyl in 2016. Almost the same response. There were like 10 people raised their hand about Onagawa, almost everybody about Fukushima. And that 10, 5 of them were Japanese, or 8 of them were Japanese. Why haven't you heard about Onagawa? Mark? Any idea? Adam, you are my USC friends. Okay, because nothing has happened. Nothing has happened at Onagawa, right? That's a very good, fair answer, and I rest my case. Marsha, do you accept that? Nothing has happened. But what does it tell you if I tell you that on that coast of Japan, there was Fukushima Daiichi, Fukushima Daini, and there was a third nuclear power plant called Onagawa. That was 60 kilometers closer to the epicenter. 60 kilometers closer to the epicenter. And the tsunami height over there was 1 meter higher than Fukushima Daiichi that I visited. And it had 3 similar type of reactor, boiling water reactor Mark 1 GE, and they were all unoperational. But you haven't heard about that. Isn't that interesting? A simple answer, we have written paper on that on the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and other papers with my former student. Our simple answer, when I checked that with some of Japanese, or short answer, not simple answer. Onagawa belonged to a utility called Tohoku, versus Fukushima Daiichi and Daini belonged to another utility called TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company. And TEPCO management, CEOs, and others, they were caught many times. That was part of their company culture with falsification of data, cover-up, complicity, as if I may quote my dear friend, Dr. Marsha Ershaqi. However, Tohoku people were very open. And they learned lessons and they improved that. I think there has been a lot of discussion about that, the issue. And the regulatory mechanism was the same for them. The public policy was the same, NISA, Nuclear and Industrial Safety Organization. It was really their corporate culture and the ethical value of those CEOs in Tohoku versus TEPCO that saved that plant. Of course, with some preparation and that. That is something that I want to leave with you when you think about the importance of ethics in the C-suite, as Dean Yorses mentioned this morning, and as Marsha talked about that. The ethics in C-suite may not have an immediate impact, but after a few years could really save you from a devastating tsunami. With that long introduction, I would like to introduce our first speaker, my dear colleague, Dr. Andrea Armani. Andrea is the new holder and newly bestowed chair of Ray Irani Chair in Chemical and Material Science. She's a great colleague. She has a fantastic lab in the new building, Michelson. She has been very nice to my students. That's why I give her the floor.
Thank you very much. I have pictures because I figured hopefully it would keep you all awake at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon if I show you pretty pictures that are colorful. But following up on Alexander's comments about how it is very important to think about your role in ethics from your role, whether it's your personal ethical behavior versus your role as an ethical scientist or engineer. And it was actually very interesting for me to listen to him as a physician versus the other side, because I do biomedical research, right? So we're very much complementary to each other. So I always think of ethical behavior in biology as the engineer making the tools that perhaps can put the physician in a compromising decision-making position. Like on the cloning side, right? Like it was an engineer that developed the cloning method that then forced the physicians to try to choose when to apply the cloning technique or not. But as the engineer making it, you often don't anticipate that your technology that you develop might end up having those consequences. But taking a step back, it's always interested to think about the present. But you can't really think about the present without considering the past. So if we go back in time, these are just kind of 3 historical innovations and industrial discoveries that were made. So one of them is the printing press, which was huge. It transformed how information could actually be distributed throughout a small area, throughout a country. The second is the steam engine. So this really transformed how energy could be created. It transitioned from needing coal to actually allowing engines to go across countries to transport people. And the third is a microscope. So this is actually the first microscope that allowed individual cells to be imaged and understood. So all 3 of these were great inventions. None of them really had ethical questions around them, right? So the printing press works. Great. You can disseminate information. Perfect. Awesome. So the people who developed these didn't really have any ethical concerns, right? But all 3 of these laid the groundwork and the foundation for the technologies of today, right? Infotech, nanotech, and biotech. And as was already mentioned, infotech, in other words, things like social media, have huge ethical concerns. But the original inventor of the printing press wouldn't have thought about cybersecurity as being a concern, right? It wouldn't have even been on their radar as an engineer to start thinking about, oh my God, what's going to happen if somebody taps into the optical fiber under the ocean 400 years from now and starts hacking into the cable. So a lot of times there can be unintended consequences. So how do you anticipate what those consequences are going to be when you can't even envision the future? And that's a huge challenge, and I mention that today because right now this is where we are, right? And we've already identified that there are problems. But where we're heading is here, which is literally a tangled rat's nest, right? So now you have all of these technologies, and they're all working, but they're all going to start working together. So you not only have the ethical challenges that you can identify, like cybersecurity, genetic cloning, I'm sure I can come up with nanotech hacking into the computer, like the new Intel chip challenge that was identified, where a lot of the processors have a known bug, and there isn't really a redesign fix they can do. But now all of those are going to come together. So now you're going to have additional complications layered on top of that. And how are we as engineers, and I say we because I am on the engineer side, going to predict and anticipate so that we can develop ways to address them when they actually arise in the future? And this is actually where engineers have to become better friends, right? We actually need to start working with people in policy to try to develop, and engineers are so not known with being friendly. Yeah, so we actually have to start working with people in policy to start laying down the legal code to do this. And one of the best examples of where this is going to become particularly horrible is when we actually have to start working with physicians as well. And one of the best examples is actually in healthcare. So pretty much everyone now has some sort of wearable device, whether you admit it or not. If you're walking around with a cell phone, you're probably tracking your steps. You're probably tracking how much food you're eating, maybe, maybe not. You might even be tracking things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, and that is all information that can potentially be hacked or potentially be given to your doctor. Depending on how sophisticated you are, maybe you're also trying to use this to encourage you towards wellness goals that you've also set with your physician. And how much of this information you give to your doctor could prove positive. You can also take the same type of system and start using it to optimize your prescriptions. And I'm sure almost everybody's heard of personalized medicine. Almost. How many actually understand what personalized medicine is? Yay, like half. Okay, awesome. The doctors get it, I'm guessing. So personalized medicine versus generalized medicine. So they're historically, like 100 years ago, there's kind of this generalized medicine philosophy of you give everybody the same dose and you hope for the same response. As my husband says, hope is not a plan, right? You should always have a plan. And personalized medicine is basically establishing a plan. You acknowledge that I'm not the same as every single other person on this panel, and they are not the same as each other. And therefore, since we are all unique little individual experiments, we should all have our own unique drug. And whether this means having unique dosages, unique time sequences, maybe even unique drugs, because maybe one drug doesn't work for me, but it works fabulous for the other 4 people on this panel, that is personalized medicine. There are lots of different strategies for having personalized medicine, and the first one was actually based in DNA. So it was based on understanding the root cause of disease, and once we understand that my DNA is different than everybody else, then you can start evaluating which drugs are going to work best. And the reason this took a long time was actually understanding DNA, which started in like the 1860s, had a few hiccups along the way, but it really kind of got launched in the 1990s. With the Human Genome Project. So Human Genome Project first sequenced the first human genome. This was actually one of the huge ethical challenges that faced the medical community, biology community, engineering community, because whose genome was sequenced, right? Like, nobody really asked this question, like, on the day that it was published. Now, when you think about it, and everyone is getting their like little tiny baby bits of their DNA sequenced, but they don't want it released to their insurance providers. They don't want it potentially. They only want to share some of it with their doctors. But yet, someone's genome was sequenced and published and put out in the literature. And who was that, right? And it was pretty much retracted the same day, and then sealed. And the person whose genome was sequenced was someone named Henrietta Lacks. And the reason why her genome was sequenced actually dates back 50 years before that. And Henrietta Lacks had a sample taken, a biopsy taken, without her consent, which again, huge ethical no-no. Don't do that. But had a biopsy taken without her consent, and that established the HeLa cell line, right? HeLa, Henrietta Lacks, established the HeLa cell line, which is a cell line that reproduces forever. And it was the first cell line that actually had this property. And because it was a very special cell line and was able to do this, lots of positive things came out of it. So the polio vaccine came out of the HeLa cell line. The HPV vaccine came out of the HeLa cell line. The first cloning of human cells came out of the HeLa cell line. So all of these amazing technical breakthroughs came out of this huge bioethical, egregious error. Right? There's no other way to describe it. And in 2013, 2010 as well, there have been multiple ethical probes into how to address this. Right? You clearly can't return the polio vaccine, right? You can't return cloning. You can't fix it. Henrietta Lacks actually passed away in 1951. You can't apologize, right? So how do you go back, right? And that's something that scientists who use the HeLa cell line, including me, right, like we wrestle with. How do you address once a known violation has occurred? And this is a huge problem in biology. Now, this is one example. A second, which has been in the news a lot, and this is why I actually want to explain what this is basically DNA engineering. So in the 1980s, as part of this Human Genome Project, they didn't just start with the human. Humans are really hard. They started with bacteria. So a group of researchers in Japan decided to sequence part of the genome of bacteria. And they noticed kind of this interesting section that kept repeating. They didn't know what it did, but it was repeating, and it was present in a lot of different types of bacteria. So it's probably important. So they put like a little gold star next to it. And they were like, we're going to keep our eye on this, come back to it later. And then they noticed that when they combined it with the second gene, they were able to use that pair that they called the CRISPR-Cas pair to actually edit DNA in bacteria. And so this is probably important, right? You can edit DNA in bacteria. Awesome. So then they did a lot of bacterial genome editing. Then another group of researchers decided to see if they could do this in human cells. And it turned out it worked in human cells. So they did a lot of single cell experiments in Petri dishes, right? Still 2D plates, beginning to get a little on the questionable side because you're now talking about editing human cells. Where it got really fuzzy was in 2015, when they took a non-viable human embryo, did the CRISPR-Cas editing process on it, and created a viable human. It grew, right? So now you're taking a cell that would have otherwise not lived and created a person. That's a problem, right? Because you're literally engineering life. Not surprisingly, the same year, the National Academy of Sciences convened a panel to try to decide, is this okay or not? Similarly, the last time I checked, the last time I signed it, there was a letter that had signatures of over 400 scientists, and it was December of 2015, saying that CRISPR-Cas should be outlawed and should be illegal in human cells. You can do whatever you want in animals. Can't do it in people. In 2017, the startup company was about to start human trials on a drug. So this is like the current huge battle around this. And you have the scientific community trying to put the brakes on it, but you have a company trying to push it forward. And you even have the government trying to step in, but everybody's fighting. And this is a huge active area of debate. So with that, I will hand it over.
Thank you very
Good
much,
luck.
Andrea. Thank you. That next generation of technology and society, Andrea, you set the stage for us. Our next presenter is my colleague, Dr. Randall Hill. He is the executive director of our Institute of Creative Technology, which is an advanced organization that belongs to USC, but they are in Marina del Rey area, in Playa del Rey. He has a PhD also from computer science from USC. We are a fellow Trojan.
And so we're going to create an institute that combines not only the academic expertise, but also works with the entertainment industry and what they think of as immersion, which isn't just putting on a headset, virtual reality headset, but it's storytelling. And it's a lot of other things. And so our institute is really a fusion of these different technologies of graphics research, AI, virtual reality, and storytelling. And so what I'm going to tell you is a little bit of a story about some of the research that's gone on there over the last 20 years, as I've had a ringside seat watching some amazing researchers do some things. And when you talk about cloning, we do digital cloning, okay? And so we're going to see a little bit of that here. What you see there is Spider-Man, and he's in our Light Stage 3 that was created back in the early 2000s by Paul Debevic in the graphics lab at ICT. He's being scanned. Those lights that you see are actually strobing very rapidly, and there's a high-resolution, fast camera there that's capturing him in his image so that they can create a digital double of this character that they can then use as part of the special effects in a movie. What we're essentially doing is we're enabling the special effects community to create a digital double of this character that can be relit, under any lighting condition to fit into a scene to look photorealistic like he's really there. And in a sense, we're enabling this character to do things that are impossible for a human being in some of the stunts that are created. Jump forward 5 years, and we scanned Zoe Saldana. And there's a bunch of other movies in between. But now you have us, creating the ability to actually create someone who's not human, a Navi, but, again, supporting the special effects community, enabling them to do amazing stunts and tricks that wouldn't be possible without these the digital doubles that you see there. Now, there's Zoe in her actual human form being scanned in the light stage. Skip forward a few more years. We did a project with Activision and also with NVIDIA to scan one of our researchers, a guy named Ari. He didn't want his name in there, so we call him Ira, Digital Ira. He's a photoreal character. What makes him different, because the other ones were photoreal too, what makes him different is that we could render him in real time. That we could actually, and what this does is it enables you now to put these photoreal characters into a game that you're going to be able to interact with, and they're going to look highly realistic. Now, this was going to revolutionize the way games are played, but then something else happened. I was going to reorder the slides, but I'll go through this story first. Let's see here. What you see is actually a video that was part of a front page LA Times article about a month ago. On the left is the LA Times writer. In the middle is Hal Lee, who's a researcher now who's replaced Paul Debevic running the graphics lab, and he's really an amazing researcher. What he did is he took a single photo of the LA Times writer and instantaneously created a digital puppet of him that he can control with his own face. Now, this obviously should raise some questions. If Photoshop made you doubt images that you were looking at, what they've done is they've created a technology that will make you doubt video that you're seeing in the future. Now, this isn't super high res yet, but Hal Lee guarantees me that the current generation of graphic processing units, GPUs, and machine learning, he's soon going to be able to produce characters who look just as realistic as if they were scanned in the light stage, but again, using a couple of photos from your mobile phone. So that's the groundwork. Now, it was all done for entertainment purposes, but it is part of the landscape that we have to think about. And I mean, I don't know if you can imagine a situation where you might disrupt kind of the social fabric by putting out videos of world leaders saying things they didn't really say, but that is going to be a possibility. Now, skipping back just a little bit, is a project that has some really positive social good in this technology. We worked with the Shoah Foundation to record the testimonies of Holocaust survivors in our light stage with video. We didn't create digital doubles of them because there was this ethical concern. We didn't want to have a digital double of a Holocaust survivor out there that someone could then manipulate in a false way by putting words in their mouth that they didn't actually say. What we did instead is we created huge libraries of video segments of their answers to 2,000 different questions. and each of them answered. Yeah, they were in there multiple days answering questions about their life. And in a sense, what you have here is an interactive video biography where they can talk about their memories of of really horrible events, and in a sense, keeping that memory alive and educating future generations. And these Holocaust survivors are now being put into museums around the world, including the Illinois Holocaust Museum. It was also in the National Holocaust Museum in Washington for a while. And we also recorded in Chinese a Nanking survivor, a woman who had survived very horrible things that happened during World War II. And that was recently rolled out. Now, so there are very positive ways you can use it, but obviously there are ways that can be manipulated. And those are some of the central questions you have to think about. Now I'm going to take it one step further here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we did about 5 years ago on a system where we created a virtual social worker. And the intent of this project, the design of it, was to interact with veterans and military service members who might be depressed or having issues with post-traumatic stress, but they have kind of fallen through the cracks. Maybe fallen through the cracks because they don't want to talk to anybody about their experiences or why they're feeling the way they are. So we put a virtual human to act as that interviewer into the loop. And what you're going to see is this virtual human who doesn't look photorealistic, but who has the ability to track the eyes, to read the facial expressions of the human, track the body language, listen to the prosody of the voice, and be able to detect depression, even in the vowel space that the person is using. And let's listen a little bit to this interaction.
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get us started. And please feel free to tell me anything. Your answers are totally confidential. Are you okay with this?
Yes.
So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
That's good. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm from LA myself. When was the last time you felt really happy?
When was the last time? I don't know. Yeah, I'm not someone who's really like, I don't have any real highs. I feel like I'm a level person. It's just happy. I guess to answer your question, probably a couple months ago.
I noticed you were hesitant on that one. Would you say you were generally a happy person?
I'm generally happy. It's just lately there are things just keeping me down.
Can you tell me more about that?
So that's a sample of an interaction. We have run about 400 subjects through this system. And one of the things we found is that people are actually much more willing to disclose intimate details of their emotional state and their lives to this virtual human than they are, let's say, through a questionnaire, whether it's anonymous or not. In this case, it's acting autonomously, but it's sort of set up as a decision tree, and it's following a certain protocol that psychologists use in this type of an interview. And so what we found is people make a very strong emotional connection to these virtual humans. Again, they know it's not human, but they're willing to disclose. And part of the reason for that, we think, is because of the design of the system, which is that she is not judgmental. And there's anonymity, that is being guaranteed up front. Now, I mean, those are all I mean, those are all the hot button issues, right? In ethics is, or is my conversation with this virtual human going to be private? Is it going to be just between me and that character? Or, will it be revealed? But what we've, determined, from this is that it has the potential for something like this has the potential for a lot of good in a lot of different circumstances, because it can help. And it was actually motivated 10 years ago when the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, Peter Corelli, came through the Institute. And at that time, the war was really hot, and they had so many soldiers, service members coming back with post-traumatic stress, they were overwhelmed in the system in terms of having social workers, psychologists, other professionals to actually interact with these people and do a proper screening. Instead, they had these written questionnaires, and people would generally always say, everything's fine, let me go home. I don't want to have to deal with any issues. So, he said, hey, could you use this kind of technology to do some of the screening for us? This isn't actually a treatment system, but it's a way of screening and encouraging the human to get into therapy. Now, I've gone through this, and I actually, it's funny, they said, oh, it'll take about 15 minutes. And about 45 minutes later, they said, hey, you better come out now, because, I was playing along, but she's very engaging. She's very empathetic is the way it came across. And I was telling her stories about, issues I was having in traffic that day, So the reason I show it to you is because I think it raises a lot of issues. I mean, one of them that, we are addressing is what we've come to realize is these virtual humans, because of the connection that you can make, is they can actually manipulate your emotions. And we've done a lot of experiments in negotiation where we have given the virtual human certain Machiavellian-type tendencies, where they're manipulating the emotions of the person and we found that people respond. Again, they respond to it sometimes rashly, or they fall for the gambit. And so what we're trying to do is we're stepping back and saying, okay, we're going to try to teach you about how emotions can be manipulated. But I think it's just something to be aware of as these technologies become more prevalent. People can use them to manipulate, the emotional state of the people involved. So a lot of the issues, I'm going to flash up a couple other things here. The Economist has a nice issue this month that addresses a lot of the AI questions that were coming up earlier. I wanted to point to an IEEE initiative on ethics of automation. It's a huge effort that's involved, hundreds of people to give ethical guidelines to people who are designing autonomous systems and intelligent systems. And I think that's kind of where I want to leave it, is that these things can manipulate people. They can also do some really great, social good. But there are also going to be privacy issues that have to be addressed in the long run. And my feeling is that we need to teach people how to design in an ethical way. And this particular system was designed where we had a clinical psychologist, we had the technologists, the engineers, and others who were involved. And then we went through all the protocols that are required for human subject testing to make sure that we weren't going to be revealing private information. So anyway, that is where I'll leave it, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Randall. Our next speaker is Dr. Senges. He is the head of the Google Hardware User Research. And also, I got to meet Max this morning. He has a very interesting background and outlook. I was very, very impressed. And currently, he's at Stanford Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Ali, for the invitation. Together with two colleagues who actually also both work at Google. We put together this chapter for the upcoming book, Composite Ethical Frameworks for IoT and Other Emerging Technologies. It's important to note that none of us is writing as a Google employee. If we did that, we have to go through all kinds of ethics and compliance checks and approvals. We still have to go through publication approval, but that's not the same as speaking for the company. Yeah, so just to complement a little bit what Naj said, I joined Google about 8.5 years ago after going through academia, the classic business information science path, and then asked too many why questions and ended up with a PhD in philosophy. And you know, when you do that, you ask yourself, how is that technology that you are so interested in and believe that it can benefit society, how is that actually governed? How is that evolution steered? So I had a lot of interest and questions around creative destructions and the process of innovation itself. And through that came to know Windsurf at what became the Internet Governance Forum, a place where stakeholders from all parts of the industry, of civil society, of academia, and policymakers come together. And in a way, this is a continuation of a pledge and of Vin's evangelical mission to speak for that new approach of multi-stakeholder governance, because I really believe that only if we have something that resembles a Habermasian discourse situation where you hear all different sides, you can actually make good decisions about the future of these technologies. And you know, the way I got first involved was I asked about what's an Archimedes point to get started if you want to chart out the governance for a new space like that. And it seemed that human rights is a pretty stable and good foundation for that conversation. So I was the first chair of I became the first chair of the Internet Rights and Principles Coalition, which set out not to invent a new human right for the internet or similar approaches, but to understand and transpose what it means, what the originators and what the human rights say to the digital realm. And you know, through that work, and not last through the exposure to Vint, Google noticed me and hired me, and in that moment, I actually asked myself, you know, is that really what I should do if I want to stand up for good practices in that field? And in fact, when I decided to do it, a lot of my friends back then, more activists and academics, said, like, how can you do that? And I said, well, you know, there is a case to be made that it's better to be inside and actually see what's going on than to watch from the outside. And all I can tell you is I made a promise to whistleblow if I see something bad, and I'm still there 8 years later. I'm not saying that there was nothing that you know, didn't. You know, there were accidents. I remember, you know, an engineer programming something that collected Wi-Fi addresses as they were driving around for Street View. But as far as I can tell, there's no structural, you know, conception of taking the data from people, and the rules for accessing user data are absolutely you know, hard. I've never seen anybody's data, despite all the jokes that you get at the cocktail parties. It is a very good system in place, I got to say. Still, I would not say that you know, ethical deliberations are part of how we develop products or how you know, the everyday practices are happening. However, the concept that I'm going to speak about and show you in a moment that the colleagues and myself would like to put forward for discussion, and that's why I hope I will use much less than the 10-15 minutes that I'm given in order to hear back from you, because it's really, you know, not so much telling you about the individual cases, but taking it on a meta level and asking how can we decide and think about the governance and the steering and taking the right cause when it comes to developing these new technologies. But before I do that, allow me one quick quote and maybe re-energize something that I had started in 2012, which is a Hippocratic oath for techies and policymakers. If you Google my name and put that Hippocratic oath behind it, you'll find it. I just looked, it's still there. I haven't touched it in a long time, but Vince's comments earlier today made me think maybe that wasn't such a bad idea to actually go almost on an individual basis and say, I look at that and I put my reputation, my name on the line and say, these are good practices that I adhere to. Now, when you think about these technologies and the ethical dilemmas that Andrea put forward from the bio sector, there are very similar cases, and actually what Randall just showed in his last example comes very close. I think the technology that we create is coming closer and closer to us personally, to the point where I could imagine in a couple of years it's almost an alter ego. What you see now with a OK Google or an Alexa that is more like a butler will come closer and closer to you in terms of really knowing about you and your preferences and your health data, how you feel, etc. And of course, the closer that gets, the more important the question is, how do I know that that thing is not manipulating me to go and buy a Coca-Cola or to go in that restaurant versus another restaurant? Transparency is actually more difficult in voice interfaces than it is with on-screen interfaces. So I think a number of really interesting ethical questions that we do see at the forefront, where my engineering colleagues and myself are thinking about them, but we're not actually debating them necessarily under an ethical framework, but more under a utilitarian framework, if you want, of how do we generate the benefit for the user. The Internet of Things examples that we discuss in the chapter are more framed around architectures of control versus architectures of access. If you think about Wikipedia, it actually gives access to the people to information. It is a democratic institution or service where you can actually contribute and edit. Everybody is allowed to do that. While you can see that a surveillance system for parks to ensure that no loitering and homeless people hang out is more a system of control and centralization of control. So I think there are very big practices or big picture practices at place. And certainly privacy is probably the most interesting and most difficult to transpose to the digital realm, because there are so many trade-offs and it is so individual that I, as a philosopher, have actually chosen to not talk about privacy anymore, but talk about data governance, because that tends to ground people more in actual what's feasible, what can we do, what should we do. While privacy, people always think of something that they want to keep secret or certainly not in the public realm. Data governance tends to go a little bit more in the abstract here. So in contrast to many of the speakers that we heard earlier today, I think this whole panel is more talking about how to define rules for things that are emerging, that we don't know. Right? It's not about optimizing the rules that for political process and business, but there's engineers that create something new, there's researchers who create something new, and how do they take decisions? And that's also what the paper is about. It's not so much about the usage, it's not so much about the aftermath, so to say, to deal with it. It's what should you create? And there is, again, a pretty strong dilemma or challenge in Vint Cerf actually coined the term permissionless innovation and has pointed out that the openness of the internet, the fact that nobody needs to ask what service, what website to put up, is the foundation of the creativity that it unleashed and of the economic and the general value that it created. And at the same time, here we are saying like, everybody should do X, Y, Z, and come up with a whole set of best practices and checks and balances before you can do something. Something that, as you might have guessed from my accent, my German countrymen have a long tradition, actually, because some things went wrong, to try to do what they call is technological forecasting to guide political implementation, and they're much more conservative than the States. And in fact, the recent conversation about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica is something where I read here for the first time, maybe we shouldn't have let them just run off and do all their wonderful innovations. Maybe we should have seen if we can guide and govern these kind of innovations a bit more. So interesting times for sure. My overall pledge is that we come from something that is fairly reactive and more thought of as a compliance topic to something that becomes part of the design process itself. Ethics by design. There is a more established term, privacy by design. And I would argue, and we argue in the chapter, that there are very practical benefits, and that would be what I hope to hear back on and see the discourse evolve around. The reduced risk clearly is one benefit from the legal side. Enhanced relationships in terms of brand and public relations, and increased trust, which ultimately, as we know from our economist friends, leads to lower transaction costs and faster business, better business. So if we manage to establish this ethical thinking and questionnaire as part of good business, that would be wonderful. This is the framework we proposed and would like to discuss in the wider realm. It's we actually saw and describe a circle here, or a flow going from 1 to 3, going from deontological approaches to teleological ethical approaches to virtue ethics. But in fact, reality is always more complex than you'd like. These are obviously always happening all at the same time and co-influence each other. But for simplicity's sake and to start in a logical frame, you would begin with the deontological ethics and say, okay, what are the rules and responsibilities that we are all bound to? And yes, universal human rights and the laws that we have kind of set the boundaries for the discussion, and we should never overstep them ethically. But as we're thinking about something new, the question is really, what is the goal? What's the telos of what we're doing? And I've done some really interesting thinking with John Hagel and John Seeley Brown, two colleagues who have a series of interesting papers around shaping strategies. And there it's really about thinking through what is the value proposition, what is the value, what is the vision that you put forward for an Internet of Things. And then you don't just put it out and say, well, that sounds wonderful, good intentions, let's move to implementation, but you start to test it and really have what I would call a responsible innovation approach, and ask users, ask different stakeholders to question whether that is going to work, so you don't end up with the best intentions, but on a path to hell. But in fact, and now I realize I might actually use my whole time. In fact, the implementation is what we argue in the paper, where most of the action is. It's about experimentation and innovating, and there is best practices and really engineering ethics, professional ethics that guide that. And there is professional codes of conduct that guide what an individual professional like the computer sciences, ACM, or IEEE, or IETF do. And again, it's a combination of procedural ethics or procedural questions and structural questions that are addressed here. If you think about procedural, you really want to think about fairness of process and giving everybody the possibility to weigh in, giving all different voices the floor and an equal access to the decision making, which ends up, I don't know if who's been at an Internet Engineering Task Force meeting, but that's 1,000 engineers all really passionate about the subject, and they all want the floor and all want to say what they think. So it takes forever. Unfortunately, that leads to companies like mine that say, oh, no, we're not going to go into that standardization process because that's going to delay our product by a couple of years. So some problems here with fairness and creating those equal opportunities and decision-making structures. They have the big advantage that at least for most of the cases that they discuss, there is actually a right or wrong in the sense of faster or slower, or it works or it doesn't work. That's not the case anymore when we have to set our boundaries ourselves. Do we want to allow that genetic manipulation? Do we want to allow that intervention of an AI coach, of an AI therapist, and how far can you go? How much responsibility are you willing to take? And then there are the structural debates and the structural virtues. And yes, those are very traditional terms. In fact, courage to whistleblow, courage to stand up for what you think is right. Excellence, as in technical excellence and professional excellence, or techne in the Greek perception. Truth, or really going to the bottom of science are the more classical ones. And then in the area of internet technology, I guess openness, safety, usability, those will be the key values that we see those engineers implement. And once there is an understanding and there is a best practice, you can start to think in a last step, how do you update and what new laws and variations or interpretations of rights do you have to do? So as said, we describe it as one flow, but it's really a constant multi-stakeholder deliberation and multi-stakeholder governance process that allows us to, in Bill Clinton's words, stumble forward in this amazing technology space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last speaker is again another one of our guests, this Emeritus Professor Gunnar Carlsson. Professor Carlsson is a professor of mathematics at Stanford, and he started a startup called ISC.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's been a really great event all day. So I want to talk a bit about artificial intelligence. And I think people of my generation, which is quite a long time ago, often think of artificial intelligence as taking problems that humans already solve, for which there is a human template for the solution, and implementing it in software and making it automatic. Okay. But where we're coming to now is a much broader definition of it, where in fact what we're going to be dealing with is problems that humans really don't deal with effectively, have never dealt with effectively, and nevertheless trying to solve those problems. So that includes fraud, cybersecurity, for example. Genomics is another example. And so the question are, what are the requirements? Let me come back to that in a second, because I want to just say a couple of things here about how I think this heading relates to the ethics issues that we've been talking about. First of all, I want to say that within artificial intelligence, there's sort of gee whiz things that get done in artificial intelligence. They include solving Jeopardy and playing chess. But there's also much more sort of practical, low-hanging fruit that involve the detection of problems, for example, detection of fraud or anti-money laundering and so on, which is also a very difficult task. It's not as exciting as playing chess, perhaps, or as solving Jeopardy, but nevertheless, it's fundamentally important. But specifically then, coming to the issue of particularly this panel of next generation ethics, There's a notion of detection, which I just mentioned, detecting things that we already know are, bad things, are unethical. They're detecting those things. But then the more forward-looking thing is to say, look, we've got lots of problems that are coming in where it's not so black and white, where it's not so clear, where the ethical decisions are things that people can debate and one can, can be a problem for inquiry. And I think one of the things that characterizes it, if you think about it, most of these problems that are hard technically, or that it's not technically but hard ethically, are hard exactly because they don't fit into the machine learning paradigm. The machine learning paradigm says we need to figure out something we want to optimize, and then we're going to optimize it, to the nth degree. But in fact, most of the ethics problems, there are competing priorities. And so you need to be able to deal with situations where there are competing priorities and find ways of doing that scientifically and so forth. Another issue is this, that a lot of the machine learning methods are actually black boxes or are regarded as black boxes. And that's a problem because people don't buy into that. They often will not buy into black box technologies. Financial regulators who are studying companies' exposure to risk and so on, for example, will not. Many physicians will be allergic to this kind of, to something which is just a black box recommendation or a black box action. So this is a big problem, as well as this problem of dealing with the competing priorities. So anyway, yeah, black boxes are not acceptable. And I would argue, and here I think is the financial regulation and healthcare are problems that have been out there for quite a while. I think something that's become evident just even in the last few months is the fact that when you deal with social networks and for example, the way that they will attempt to regulate speech in one way or another. One has competing priorities. One doesn't want hate speech up. On the other hand, one wants as much as possible to have people to have freedom of expression. So those are that's examples of competing priorities, and I think we're in a situation where we don't know where to draw the line there. We want to try to figure out some strategies, some criteria, and so on to deal with those competing priorities. Anyway, let me get back to the question of what now are the requirements. What would be the requirements of a system that starts to deal with some of these more complex issues? And so I would argue that there are at least 5 criteria. I think the number 2 and number 1 and number 3 are kind of the most critical ones for me. So the first is discover. It means that we need to be able to look at data because we want to base our ethical decisions on what is actually happening, what the actual facts are, not what people say they are. So we want to be able to understand data, the data that's coming in that's helping us build this new artificial intelligence technology. We want to understand it in an unbiased way. In other words, we don't want to go in there with a hypothesis. If we go in there with a hypothesis, we're going to beat and bend the data until it fits our hypothesis. It's just, it's a fact that often happens. The notion of confirmation bias. If you don't believe it, I would point you to the history of dietary cholesterol, where in the Korean War, someone who did autopsies on the U.S. GIs that died found that they had the cholesterol plaques in their arteries, in their coronary arteries. He immediately thought, it must be the diet, it must be all the beef, it must be everything that we eat that causes it. And they spent 30, 40 years doing study after study trying to prove that and finding very little signal in that. And ultimately now, in the last few years, last 5, 10 years, it's become clear that the situation is much more complex than that cholesterol has maybe much more to do with other things like inflammation and so forth. So the idea that one wants some unbiased way of understanding data, that's fundamentally important. It needs to deal with complex data because the data we're dealing with is very complicated. It needs to capture weak signal because in ethics you need to be able to look at even small things that are happening. If they're really bad, if they're happening but only happening a little bit, if you're not capturing that weak signal, you're missing it. You need to understand in your framework how do you capture weak signal as well as the strong signal, which is what you capture from machine learning. Machine learning will drive you immediately, you can find that strong signal really quickly and get some understanding of that. But what you need often is the outliers, it's the anomalies, it's the weak signals. And finally, and what that leads to is a requirement for richer outputs. It needs not to be just a classifier that says, are you a rabbit or are you a cat, if it's an image. It needs to be something richer than that, that allows you to understand the full nature of your data and everything that lies in it. Secondly, and let me move now to the third one here, which is what I would call justify and accessibility. So it needs to come out, it needs to produce answers which are justified, that are explained to people, where they're coming from, what the reasons are that you're making a recommendation or a proposal. It also means that you need to be able to understand what your algorithm is doing. And that goes directly to the black box business. You need to be able to understand it because otherwise financial regulators, for example, will not buy into it unless you have an understanding of what's being done. If you can explain to doctors what they're doing, there's a chance that they can use it and so forth. So those are two primary ones here, the discovery, the unsupervised analysis, the unbiased analysis, and then secondarily the ability to get some accessibility into the notion of your algorithms without having to just say, well, it's some machine, I don't know what it's doing, but this is what it's telling me to do, so I better do it. Okay. So, and now very quickly, I know we're short. Question is, I'm just going to give you, and bear with me here, I hope you'll find it enjoyable, 2 minutes on how one strategy for accomplishing some of these goals, particularly requirements 1 and 3 that I mentioned there. So an organizing principle for complex data for us is that the data has shape and the shape matters. I claim everybody in the room knows this because you've all done a regression line at some point where you've approximated your data by a line. On the other hand, data doesn't always agree to lie on a line. It might look like this instead. There's a characteristic structure here, namely it's broken up into 3 pieces, and I can characterize that also as being approximating by a shape, but not by a straight line, by 3 discrete points. Okay? And these two, a lot of methodology has been developed around them, and we could hope that maybe we were done at this point until we'd run into a data set that looks like this, which doesn't have the shape of 3 points. It's not a straight line, but it's a loop instead. And here, you know, this is nicely approximated by a loop. That happens when you have time series data, so to speak, data that's time varying, data that's coming from some periodic or recurrent behavior. So we might say, let's develop a detector for those things, but then we'd run into a data set that looks like this. Here, this might be where I'm flying across the ocean in a jetliner. I have a normal mode of behavior, which is flying at altitude in non-turbulent conditions, and then 3 extremal modes, which would be takeoff, landing, and flying under turbulent conditions. So Y-shape. I don't want to have to build an individual set of models for each of these. I don't want to say lines, clusters, loops, and so forth, because I will never run out. I will never finish. I need instead to build some methodology that captures all of them at once. And that's what's called, we called it topological data analysis. I won't go through the details of it, but just to give you a sense of it, this came from a problem in the 1700s, a recreational math problem, where the questions concerned, you know, what sort of tours can I take of the 7 bridges crossing the River Pregel in Königsberg? A Swiss mathematician named Leonhard Euler solved the problem by observing that there was a lot of irrelevant detail in the information about the bridges. How long are the bridges? How deep is the river? How big are the islands? All those things don't matter as far as the problem, which was, can I cross each bridge exactly once doing a tour? And so he found this simplified representation on the right, which allowed him to solve the problem in short order. And that's what we do with data. That's the new kind of modeling. It's no longer modeling by equations, which is not sensitive enough to capture many of the complex phenomena, but rather modeling by complex networks. So to give you a sense, just a couple of examples. This is work that's been done in the direction of precision medicine, as was mentioned before. Here, this was a finding from a group at Mount Sinai. It found that the type 2 diabetes actually divides into 3 and actually currently 4 groups that are genomically distinct and therefore can be treated individually. So it's a step in the direction of the personalized medicine. Another direction of precision medicine is to try to understand the process of becoming sick under an infectious disease. And if you think about it, that should be a loopy model because you start out healthy, You go and you get sicker and sicker and sicker, and then at a certain point, your immune system kicks in, and now you go back, but you go back by a different route. So it's a loopy model, and this has allowed David Schneider, who is the investigator here, to do a lot of interesting work about the immune system. So now let me finish by saying, so deep learning is something you may have read about. It's a very powerful methodology. It can be made to classify things in images that you wouldn't think it could classify, that you wouldn't think could be done automatically, or it's very non-intuitive. On the other hand, it is regarded as a black box, and part of that then means that its utility is restricted just because people don't trust black boxes, but it also leads to vulnerability to adversarial attacks. So in other words, you have something which classifies dogs and cats, but if you change a cat's ear a little bit, or you change the background a little bit, it can mess up the classification. That's called the adversarial attack. So you can't diagnose what's going on. You can't. Therefore, that means you can't fix it. Okay. And so what that means is that actually, in this case, the machine itself becomes a data analysis problem. In other words, the states in the machine. If you can start to analyze the data from that, you can actually start to understand what's going on internal to the machine. And that's what's very powerful. And so what we found is that actually there are 4 points of contact, so to speak, with the methodology I just talked about here. It can produce better features for the machine, for the deep learner to absorb and use. It can study this internal state of the machine, which in this case divides into 2 different groups, called the weights and the activations. And finally, you can also teach it to learn richer models, the richer models that are required to sort of do this analysis of the competing priorities. The learner can also do those when suitably tuned and given suitable features about those networks. So thank you very much for staying in the very late hour. So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much. There was one question given to me that belongs to Dr. Hill. I asked Dr. Hill to read it. Could you please read the question and answer it?
Sure.
And there is one more. Okay.
The question is, how can you hold AI, like the social worker in the video, accountable for codes of ethics? And I think I look at this a couple of different ways. One is, it goes back to what I was saying before. I think that you have to design in the ethics. That has to be a very conscious decision as you're designing your system. And one of the ways that we've done that is, number one, to make sure that we're following certain practices that are sanctioned by, let's say, the medical community or the social work community. But also when we're experimenting with this system, we use what we call a Wizard of Oz approach, so that we actually have humans in the loop when we're initially designing it, to finding out what the parameters are, where people actually behave within the system. I also believe, and going back to the black box comment, is that your system has to be transparent. So if you're having to do some kind of an analysis afterward, if it veered off course somehow, you can go back and say, why did it make the decision it did? And it was because it didn't recognize what was actually being said by the human. Did it like Siri or Alexa or somebody, maybe it understood something completely different from what was said. And we have ways of capturing that. And I guess the other comment I'll make is that we have had instances where, we treat this as a research platform for us, and we want to rigorously test it. And we've had instances where some of the people the subjects who've been in there have actually begun to indicate suicidal tendencies. And we stopped the session at that point and got them help. And in a sense, that's what our system is, the way it's supposed to act anyway, is that it's not there to provide the actual therapy. It's there to screen, to ask questions, to get people to disclose, and then guide them to help if it's needed. So that's a short answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hill. Max, there is a question for you. Can you please read the question?
Yes, happy to, but now that I am given the mic, I can't resist to add that, of course, that is the first step, and I think it's a very good precautionary principle not to jump into actual interventions and coaching. But I would argue that in expert systems, so systems that are guided, as you pointed out, by best practices, are upon us. I don't think that the AIs will get to that general level AI that they will just think for themselves what to do. But given the signals, I think we will see that the reactions are more and more sophisticated, most likely faster than we imagine in the moment. The question that was posed to me is we have been applying second-generation policies and regulations to sixth and seventh generation technology, and this gap is increasing more and more. What are your views about it? And well, I'd love to get a read of the second, sixth, and seventh, how that was estimated. But in general, of course, the notion is true, and in fact, we're so much on the same wavelength here that I'm reading my email footer to you. It's a quote from Edward O. Wilson, an evolutionary biologist from Harvard, who said the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I do think that there is some exaggeration in it, but it is true that there is an imbalance. Now, historically, and Vint would, of course, be in a much better position to answer that, the technologists were left to their own devices, and they came up with a pretty good system. I got to say that the openness of debate for academic fora and technology fora, like the Internet Engineering Task Force, is quite remarkable. So when the societal problems first came up, late 90s, early 2000s, the reaction from the business and tech community was, okay, policymakers, we understand there is something going on, but please, don't disrupt a running system. First, learn why it's working and what you would do if you did an intervention. So that was about, I'd say, at least 10 years of practice of learning, mostly, I'd say, on the policy side, but also some learning on the technology side about how to do policy work and structure policy debate. That said, I think there's some sparks of light in places like the Internet Governance Forum, but the fact that it's not a decision-making body and the fact that most of the questions are still unsolved lets me conclude that this is unfortunately a true statement. We have not found a good way to govern the technologies and the innovation.
Thank you very much, Max. Thank you very much. Before I give the floor to my friend Ali, I want specifically to thank Ali Abbas here. You don't know how much this gentleman has worked. I have received more than 100 emails since he thought about the conference. The student 17 paper or so that you collected, emails about that, many emails, he, Stefan G. and others that they sent us. Ali, really, we owe a lot to you. You have done marvelous job. And I would like to thank Mr. Neely again for your generous contribution. You are the raison d'être that we are here. And also I want to send a special thank to that charismatic professor back there, Professor Jim O'Toole. I remember, Jim, I was almost your student in 1980 in Bridge Hall. Mike Driver was my student, but I used to see you. Neely Center is in good hands. Thank you for running that for many years.
Thank you very much, Naj. Thank you for everyone. And this could not have happened without everybody here. And I really appreciate, just the level of the speakers, the participation, the students. We'll be in touch. This is one of many, many more to come. And thank you for helping make this event a great success. Thank you.